going to thank our host, actually. It's nice that HUD was, and the grants people that helped us to hold this here. Thank you very much. And so welcome to HUD, but also to George Washington University. The Trachtenberg School is a graduate school at GW with masters in public policy and public administration and Ph.D. programs for those who might be interested also in public policy and administration. We want to help prepare and develop the skills in our students to be in a world in which there's a lot of grant making, with billions and billions of dollars more money spent on grants management than on contracting in the federal government now. It's big business, but it also, as just a peek at findings, you'll find there's still a huge desire for more skilled grants managers throughout the grants management system. So this is our little baby steps forward, working with REI to bring people together to share promising practices, or to at least complain together about some of the things that we wish would change. And so welcome, and I'm going to introduce my partner in these breakfasts. Jeff, where are you? You're right behind me. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you. Jeff does the heavy lifting, and thank you for bringing together some great panelists today. I'm very excited to listen to them.
Thanks very much, Kathy. So I always like to give kind of just a little bit of an overview to the Grants Management Breakfast series that we have together with George Washington University. And the purpose of it's pretty simple. It's to try and build and strengthen a community of folks who are facing similar sorts of problems and challenges and successes, and to be able to give them a venue to be able to share some of those experiences and some of those tactics of how they succeeded with each other. So a lot of the purpose of this is for you to have a chance to get to meet each other and to kind of help advance the capabilities of a variety of different government agencies at the federal, state, and local level, as well as nonprofits who are carrying out important mission work through grants. I also want to thank in particular the representatives from the grants team at the Housing and Urban Development Department, James Norsworthy and Rita Yorkshire. Thank you very much for hosting us. We are trying this as an experiment. We'll have to see whether or not it seems to work and is convenient for you all. In particular, though, I want to give you a little bit of an overview, there's a minor typo in the agenda. We're going to have the Q&A discussion from 10:30 to 10:45 or later. And in fact, actually, a number of us will be able to stick around afterwards, although we have to give up the room by 11:30. But we do hope that you will ask questions as the panel discussion goes on, and to a certain extent as well during the Q&A session. Technically, there are going to be about 20 minutes or so worth of presentation to survey results, so you'll see the whole thing at that point from myself and my colleague Virginia Wackness, and then we'll invite the panelists up to the stage, and they'll tell you a little bit about, from their perspectives, what they think some of those survey results mean, kind of within the context of their agency and their experience. We invite you from the audience, many of whom are experienced grant managers, to offer your perspectives as well. We invite you to ask questions during that period of the panel being on stage. You're welcome to ask questions either of the panelists or of Virginia and myself about the research. We would also really like to encourage you to think about what are some topics that you really are curious about the overall context of the grants management community, and say, hey, can you add a question like this to the survey next year? We try and keep the survey response time to about 15 minutes or less, so generally if we add new questions, we try and take some out, and we try and keep a pretty consistent set of questions, 80 or 90% consistent year to year, so that we can track trends. But that's one of the things that I think is actually really interesting about both this Breakfast Forum series and this survey. It gives a real chance for people within the community to understand not just what's going on in their neck of the woods, in their agency or their program, but also to see what others are doing and where they may be really succeeding and have known that and want to kind of tout their success as they seek budget or seek authorization or seek to improve their program, and where they have an opportunity to learn lessons from others. So we really hope that this overall survey experience gives you a perception of kind of where you and your agency stand and where there may be opportunities for improvement. And we invite you to help think about not only where there are improvement opportunities for individual agencies, but where there may need to be some sort of systematic government-wide effort or initiative. One of the things we're proud about after having done this survey for about 4 years is that in previous years, results of the survey have been identified as some of the justification for priorities within the President's management agenda. So government-wide folks really are listening, and they're listening not only to you as a survey respondent, but also to you and your experiences through interactions like this. With all that kind of as background, what we're going to do is we're going to slip into the presentation of survey results. Now, one of the comments is, one of the things I want to make clear is, everybody who is here has registered for this event. We will share these survey results directly, this entire slide presentation with you within the next 48 hours. So you'll have a chance to see it. You don't have to make copious notes and take pictures as you go along, although you're certainly welcome. As well, everybody who responded to the survey and indicated they wanted to receive the results and shared with us a way to get the results to them will also get those results. And we're happy to, again, take your feedback, answer your questions remotely or what have you. These results, this survey, I want to mention briefly, is conducted and sponsored by both REI Systems, the National Grants Management Association, and George Washington University. And it's something where, again, we try and make sure that it's conducted in a rigorous way. I'll give you a couple of caveats about that, however. I want to start out giving you kind of the big picture first, and this is to kind of give you a chance to kind of understand and digest a little bit about what you're going to hear, start to develop some of your questions and thoughts, and think about how it applies to you. For those of you who've been paying attention over the 4 years we've been doing this survey, the first time we did the survey, it was kind of surprising to me that when we asked what types of things a grant manager spends their time on, the highest single use of time was on administrative compliance. And as a trend over time, the amount of time, a proportion of which people are spending on administrative compliance has been increasing. This year, it's not increasing quite as fast as it had been. But one of the questions, surprise, surprise, we'll have from the panel, and I would encourage you to think about as well, is why is it increasing? Is it the right amount of time being spent on administrative compliance? And are there things that can be done about it, either again at the level of an individual grantee or at the level of kind of a government-wide perspective with respect to policy that could help reduce time spent on administrative compliance and therefore allow increased time to be able to spend with technical assistance, program evaluation, sharing knowledge and lessons learned, doing the day-to-day work to increase and improve the mission outcomes that result from the grants. The second topic is a new one for this year. We added, based on some suggestion last year, the question about how much, as a proportion of the grant dollars dispersed by your agency, how much does your agency spend on administration? And we were surprised this year because the answer from a number of agencies was very modest amounts, less than 2%. But quite a few other agencies were kind of all across the board, and a number said, quite a significant number in fact, said more than 20% of the money we disperse in grants, we spend more than 20% of that amount on administration. Now, there are some weaknesses in the analysis about being able to compare apples to apples between these organizations, but we think this provides for the first time an important sense of context about what does grant administration cost, and it will open up, especially in conjunction with the Data Act and the grants data standards that OMB is establishing together with HHS and some government-wide coordinating groups. We think it will create the opportunity to think carefully about where and how is frugality achieving good results, and I'm going to call it frugality because you might say, well, it's efficiency, but in some cases it might not be. It might be, you just employ lots fewer people to oversee and monitor and assure the quality of grant outcomes. Maybe that's not efficient. So I'm going to call it frugality, and I'm going to slip once in a while. But the question will be whether or not and where frugality, how it is achieved, or on the other kind, we'll kind of just call it a big spender, how that happens and why, and what might be some options to do something about that, where agencies want to do something about that individually, or where there may be some interest perhaps in gathering different data or more data and making some policy decisions at a cross-government level. The third topic, and this is one that repeats from last year, is many agencies are not able to measure the outcome performance for their grant mission achieved. And a number of additional agencies said performance is declining. And so performance seems to be a big issue. It's a little different than last year because last year it seemed as if it was a bigger issue at the federal government. This year it's not so clear, and I suspect that's just due to kind of random variation in our sample with the survey. But the issue is performance does seem to be a topic of strong concern and interest in grant management because after all, the reason grants happen is the federal government says we're a relatively efficient fundraiser through taxation, but we're not as good always at delivering the service because the service may be better delivered by someone close to the customer, the state or the local government or nonprofit. And the question really is, are we able to judge kind of whether or not we're getting what we expect for those grant monies? And to a certain extent also, are we able to use really the ultimate benefit of grants, of allowing lots of different types of innovations to be tried and experimentation and learning about what really works? Are we really taking advantage of that by figuring out what did work? So that's kind of the performance topic. The last, and we'll get some specifics as we go into some of the detail of the survey results, is everyone seems to want more data sharing and easier data sharing, ideally kind of on an automated basis with IT, between the grantors and the grantees. And this is a little bit from the survey results, but a little bit also from some focus groups that we've done. There is a strong feeling amongst grant recipients that they're not afraid to be compared with other grant recipients and to have transparently presented data that says, here's how one grant recipient is doing and here's how another grant recipient is doing. And the reason I think that that is true from the focus groups we've conducted is a bunch of grantees understand they tend to operate in their own community and to a certain extent in a silo, and they have a lot to learn from other grantees. And if there's no real transparency of data across grantees about whether it be administrative spending or performance outcomes or management techniques, if there's no real transparency on those topics, they can't learn and get better quite so easily from some of their peers who may have similarly faced some sorts of challenges. And that's actually a place where you'll hear during the research that we've kind of drawn a conclusion and a suggestion that we're making as the researchers, which is there seems to be a need for a better ability not just to share data, but to share knowledge and to share lessons learned, and to be able to do that relatively efficiently, presumably with some sort of technology, but also to do that kind of on a just-in-time basis. When you're just about to send your grant application in, or when you're just about to define your performance measures, or when you're just about to make an organizational change within your grant recipient organization, that's when you may want those information bits from other people who have succeeded. And so I think that will be something that I see as a kind of a big and an important challenge this year in the grants management community. Let me give you just kind of a brief picture. We're going to talk a little bit about the methodology. And again, I'll ask you to hold your questions for a little bit here until the end of the research presentation, hopefully over the course of the next 10 to 15 minutes. We'll talk a little bit about who responded, how grant managers spend their time, the administrative spend topic, performance, and across a wide range of issues, just which ones did people feel most strongly about and supportive of, and which did they feel were the biggest problems or feel least strongly about. And then there are the key capstone questions at the end of the survey saying, what do you think are your biggest challenges? What do you think are the things you were most successful at? And the key takeaways we've already kind of touched on, but there's something at the end that'll be a little too small to see. I'll hit a few highlights early, and then you may want to look through these as you get the research results. And those are, most of the survey respondents said, in response to our question, here's something I did that made it possible for me to be really successful. So we asked people to kind of sit and write down, what is it that you think is the best thing that your organization is doing that others could learn from? And those produce some really interesting sorts of suggestions. I've kind of tried to group them in categories, but we think those will be really fascinating, even though you may not be able to read through them all in detail during the presentation here. Just as a bit of background, if you're not familiar, the National Grants Management Association is an association voluntarily, generally of individuals and organizations, and they provide tools and resources that include training and a knowledge sharing portal and a variety of other sorts of services, as well as certification for grants managers. Kathy gave a nice introduction to the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. We asked a number of different universities, are you interested in partnering with REI around grants management? And almost all of them said, yes, we love helping people get more grants and remain in compliance. And their perspective is almost entirely on the side of grant recipients. That led us to George Washington University because unlike most of the other organizations in higher education in the arena, George Washington University and Kathy in particular were interested not just in the grantee perspective, but in the perspective of how to improve the management of grantors. And given, as she says again, that this is more than 20% of the federal budget, more than $700 billion, it's an important way to carry out federal policy and management. And so the ability and interest in studying it is something we really have to congratulate George Washington University for. Last, very briefly, REI Systems, if you're not familiar with it, provides technology support and advice to both grantors and grantees. One very brief thing about that I just want to mention that very recently we've had a couple of different agencies ask us, and we've been using artificial intelligence to help them screen candidates for expert selection review panels. So instead of just going back to the same 5 or 10 or 15 different researchers to help sit on their selection panel for a competitive scientific research grant, we can help them scan through thousands of resumes and curriculum data from universities across the country to pick out who might be the very best in a changing group of selection panels. So we're using things like artificial intelligence to help solve real problems to both make the grant management process more efficient and also make it stronger and better able to kind of represent a diverse perspective and to achieve the mission of those grants in terms of choosing the best scientific research applications in those instances of competitive grants. Of course, we also work with a variety of grantors who make block grants and formula grants as well, and a number of grantees, both at the federal as well as state and local level. We've kind of already talked a little bit about the survey, so I'm going to go through this quickly. We usually give about a month. In this case, it was November of 2019. We invite about 5,000 people to take the survey. Many of them choose to, many of them choose not to. As well, grants.gov, NGMA, the American Council for Technology also help distribute the opportunity to respond to the survey. If you do not respond to it, we hope you'll do that again we hope you will do that next year. You'll get the invitation based on you having registered for this event. The survey responses were anonymous. A few folks chose to share with us their identity in order to get the survey response, actually more than 208 out of 309. But we did promise, and we do keep that promise, not to associate individual agencies or individual respondents with the results. So if you say to me, well, who is it that answered that? The answer is either I don't know or I won't tell you. Just as a quick summary, we had a mix of responses from both the grant maker, grant recipient perspective, some who are passed through and do both. We had a range of folks who were both federal, state, local, other, and non-profit respondents, tribal folks. Most of the folks who responded have more than 10 years of experience, although there is a range. A few folks at the younger end of 0 to 2 year experience, as you see. So the first significant topic area is how grant managers spend their time. And the issue here, again, as you see at the very top, although it's not necessarily immediately clear, the dark blue line is the 2019 data, which is this year's data. And what you see is there's actually a significant amount of consistency, but not really the change that perhaps might have been hoped for. The first two topics are how much of your time do you spend monitoring financial administrative requirements and monitoring non-financial administrative requirements. Those two together are kind of administration and compliance requirements. And although you may not be able to easily see it, it's about 30%, just over that for the financial, and it's just about 15% for the non-financial. So the bottom line is about 45% of grant managers who responded to the survey spend 45% of their time on administrative compliance. Now, I want to make sure that it's clear to you from the dynamics of the survey. These are voluntary responses. These are people who are generally not going back to look at their time cards. So they're self-reporting information based on their own judgment. And what's more, we can't tell you that this is a perfect representative sample of all the grantees in the country, or all the university faculty, or all the university grant recipients in the country. It's not a representative sample and cannot readily be extrapolated in a robust way that's statistically significant and valid. That's the caveat. It is, I think, however, nevertheless, pretty good information, which is telling you that administrative requirements are a big chunk of time. And so the question that we'll have for the panel will be, is this okay? Is there something that we should do to try and change this? Is there some reason this has kind of continued to increase, although, again, the rate of increase has dropped slightly? So the next topic I find interesting because this is in terms of training requirements, and although, again, it may not be quite as easy to see, the blue, the dark blue and the medium blue represent agencies and grant managers who are part of an organization that has a training requirement of some sort. 60% have no training requirement. The 11%, the smallest portion, is there's a requirement for training and there is a certification requirement. So not only must you be trained, but here's how much and here's kind of on what topics. And we found this really interesting in comparing with the subsequent portion of the research and the survey results, which is the single biggest factor in success reported by respondents was well-qualified staff. And so the question we'll have for panelists, and frankly for you as well, is if there is this kind of loosey-goosey kind of training requirement, how do you make sure that you get well-qualified staff? Now let me just, as a show of hands here, how many folks, before before they finished their education, whether it be college or graduate education, knew they wanted to go into grants management. Anybody? So in my entire career, I knew one person. He said, you know, I pursued a Ph.D. I didn't want to go tenure track because the usual way you get into grants management is you ask for tenure and you pursue it over 6 or 8 years. You get denied tenure, and then if you got accepted and you got tenure, of course you would take tenure. But if you didn't, then you would go into grants management. He said, you know, I wanted to be a grants manager, and so that's why immediately after my Ph.D. I entered the Master of Public Policy program, where he was my classmate. He's the only person I've ever met in my whole life over 30 years that said, I want to be a grants manager. So the question again is kind of, nobody really plans to start as a grants manager as far as I can tell. How is it that we can have them be better qualified? Especially given the current context of, we don't require training in very many instances, and certification almost never, 11% of the time apparently. Switching topics. This is a little bit of a complex slide, but I'll give you the kind of the color coordination and hint. This is the question on administrative spend. And the question, in each case, you'll see at the top of the page is the question that we ask. What percentage of the annual value of grants processed by your organization does your organization's administrative budget constitute? And what you see essentially in the orange on the right, those are the big spenders. Those are people who spent more than 20% of the value of their grants on administering the grant program, as opposed to housing the homeless, providing food, providing employment training, carrying out the mission. And so what you'll see is interesting is I kind of came into this with the predisposition, hey, the federal agencies are large and they're sophisticated, they have people dedicated to this, they're probably going to be pretty frugal. And it turns out not to be the case. Actually, 27% of federal agencies reporting said their agency spends more than 20% of its budget. Now, on the other side, you have the dark blue, which is the less than 2%, and the medium blue, which is the 2 to 5%. Those are the ones I'm calling frugal. And so essentially what you're seeing is, across the board, but a little more so at the local level, we have quite a number of agencies who report spending very scant amounts of money. Now, there are kind of a couple of potential explanations for this, but again, we'll ask the panelists to kind of interpret both how this arose and a little bit about, well, should we do something about this? Is this a problem? Is this okay? Is this not? The caveats are, people may be, again, self-reporting, and they may be saying, hey, you know what, we have a vendor, and they only cost us 1.5% of our budget, so we're pretty slim, and they may never count the staff salary or fringe benefits or other travel or education or what have you. So we may have people who aren't necessarily counting all of the dollars appropriately. Our thought is that actually having the data standards that are both in the GREAT Act and being promulgated by OMB and HHS may help clarify kind of what could be interpreted to be types of spend that are administrative or not, but there may be still some more room to try and kind of set policy to say, let's call this administrative spend or not. The other response I heard at one point in discussing these casually with a colleague was, well, of course some of the local governments are quite frugal. They're required to be because they're not allowed to have a really high indirect cost. And my response to that was, so when the government says you have a cap on spending, that makes you more frugal. Again, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? We had a number of responses that kind of complained about the caps. We had a number of other responses saying, well, yeah, we're pretty efficient. But the last and the most significant lesson I drew from this, again, is there are organizations at all levels of government and nonprofit who are spending either at very frugal levels or very high levels, and they aren't really at this stage, to my perception, learning from each other and making it as a really conscious decision. And until now, it was very difficult for them to realize kind of where they fit in this context. So I bet a lot of money that for most of you in this room, before seeing this slide and hearing this overview, you didn't know whether your organization was frugal or a big spender. And you didn't know whether or not it was average or a really, really big spender. And so I think kind of the survey results provide that really interesting information that, again, my biggest hope is will cause more information sharing so that where an organization says we're facing a budget cutback and we need to be more frugal, how do we do that? There's an ability to say, oh, well, these several organizations are more frugal, let's learn from them and figure out how did they do that. And at the same time, over a period, hopefully we can do a better job connecting what is, as I kind of already suggested, mediocre performance data to say, well, you know, is it the case that the ones who are really frugal are actually just at the pits for performance, and the ones who are big spenders are getting spectacular performance? Or maybe it's vice versa. At this stage, it's just really hard to tell. So let's talk about it. And again, I've kind of already shared most of this with you, but the question is, again, self-reported, your performance for your organization, is it improved? And in many instances, our thought was, has it improved a lot or a little, and how did you improve it, and so forth. And what we eventually got was lots and lots of folks just don't know. About half of the response to the survey said either, I don't know, we don't measure performance, we can't gather it, we can't burden the grantees to report it, or they don't report it consistently, or every different grant program we have and every different grantee defines their own metrics, and so we really can't aggregate in any particular way. And then there were a number who said our performance fell, which again is not surprising, but some performance should go up and should go down if people are trying different things and if they're trying to kind of take advantage of the opportunity to innovate as they pursue a grant. But the bottom line is, it looks like at least half of folks don't have a grip on performance or performance is falling. Could learn something from those whose performance is improving, and it should be something where maybe it is a little bit of a cause for concern if our purpose is to try and achieve these mission objectives, and we either aren't achieving or don't know. This is the last topic that I'll touch on, and then I'll invite my colleague Raju to walk this, who did a substantial bulk of work on this survey. This topic is essentially kind of trying to drill down a little bit further. It's a new topic for this year on a performance issue. And this was, we heard some complaints about people saying from a focus group of grant recipients, yeah, it's really tough for us to demonstrate performance because you know what, we apply for the grant and we don't even know what the performance expectations are until after we've gotten the grant. And sometimes we then have to go back and start gathering data, maybe making it up for months past, because we didn't know what the data requirements and performance data calls would be until after we actually started the program. So one of the hints, and a strong kind of hint from a number of the grant recipients, was please make clear the performance expectations at the time the grant is awarded or before, ideally, and perhaps think about the opportunity to kind of contrast the desire for innovation in how the program performs and how to measure that from kind of the expectations of the overall mission. And my arbitrary suggestion, which basically is not maybe worth a lot, but worth thinking about, is perhaps some 50% of performance measures required in the grant program could be proposed by the innovative grant recipient who's got a great idea for a new program, and the other 50% could be identified by the grantor who says, you may be proposing wonderful different ways to do this, but we still want this sort of result. We want more people housed, or we want more people trained and employed, or what have you. And so there should be perhaps some sharing of responsibility for setting those performance metrics, and ideally they should be set far enough in advance that the program can be planned and carried out in a way that achieves those. Sorry, I lied, although these last two are, I think, don't need a huge lot of attention. Surprise, surprise, most of the grant managers are relying on self-reported data. They often define their own performance metrics, they gather their own data. That seems to be what's most heavily relied upon. And people tend to rely on data that's quantified and that's credible, and that more often tends to be financial data than other types. So with that, Rajuta, let me invite you up, and Rajuta will talk a little bit with you about the remainder of topics here.
Thank you, Jeff. So we are going to go through a couple of topics here where we actually saw pretty high scores, so people felt really strongly about, and some where they thought that there was a lot of areas of improvement or there was more impact that could be seen. The first one I think Jeff has already talked about in the key takeaway slide. We consistently see this, that there is interest in having the state and federal government automate more transactions and share more data. Naturally, the next question is what kind of data and how do we do that? So that's a topic we're going to quickly go through in the panel later today. But we've also heard this a lot in the focus groups that we've conducted with grantees, where they're asking for more and more standardization, more and more common single entry points to get data to different agencies in one go instead of having to do it multiple times. The second topic in terms of the impact of legislative and executive directives, not surprisingly, the Uniform Grant Guidance has the most impact on day-to-day lives for grants managers. However, I think it's of note to see that the CAP Goal 8 or the Cross-Agency Priority Goal 8 under the President's Management Agenda in the short 2 years that it has been around has also started to make an impact in terms of the day-to-day existence. Now that the GREAT Act has passed at the end of 2019, perhaps this year and perhaps next year we'll start adding that as well to see how much of an impact that has on day-to-day activities for the grants manager. This is another topic that we've been exploring since this survey began. We know that the leadership and executives continue to be interested in getting data and analytics out of their grants activities. This is a topic that consistently scores high. However, the word here that we use in the question is interest. So does that mean that they're getting the data and analytics? We'll explore a little bit later. But we know that they are trying to do this for decision making. They're trying to use it for things like grantee assessments in terms of applications, evaluations of their program, risk assessment perhaps, and even workload management for their staff. Having said that, one of the interesting things is that we see the satisfaction with both the availability of data and the skill sets needed to analyze and generate insights from that data is not very high. And again, this is a question we've asked before. It continues to be on the areas of improvement side of things. But we want to explore in the panel what are we going to do about some of these areas. Perhaps some of the training and qualifications that we talked about earlier, is this an area where we want to focus on to increase that skill set, to increase how we're going to automate some of that data entry, how we're actually collecting the data. That is an area here that we should explore. However, the confidence in the agency or the entity's ability to meet their grant program outcome is still pretty high. It has continued to be high, even though it has slipped slightly this particular year. And that's a topic we'll look at in the panel as well. Why is it slipping? Is it really slipping? What can we do about that? This is consistent with some of the reporting that Jeff mentioned. We continue to see that feedback from grantees on the grant program is primarily collected through the annual reporting mechanism. Now, a lot of these are formal written reports, and the question is there space or is there a area in that report to actually collect feedback on the program? Are there other ways that feedback can be collected? We know many agencies have project officers who conduct monthly, quarterly check-ins. Perhaps they're already collecting that feedback. Maybe it's not documented in a system or a shared location. There's some conversations there in terms of what is the best way to collect feedback from grantees about your grant program. A similar topic here is that grant automation in terms of the reporting. We still see a lot of reliance on emails and ad hoc submissions. So the direct data entry here represents a system or a portal or a single place where the grantees can go and enter information. But many times we see that combined with emails or only emails, no entry at all. What this means is, of course, the data sometimes stays unstructured, it's difficult to aggregate, it's hard to report on. Getting the analytics and the aggregation becomes a challenge. So again, an area where perhaps there is more work to be done on both the grantor and grantee sides. I believe this one Jeff touched on as well. This is an area that consistently scores low as well over the years that we've done this survey. While the access to technology and the use of technology, the satisfaction is medium or moderate. Consistently, the cost of that technology and the cost of some grantees to use technology to do that kind of reporting continues to be an area of concern. This is a topic we've explored quite a bit in the panel last year, and perhaps if we get to it today as well, we'll try to see what can we do about that. How can we share some of that cost? How can we get grantees and sub-grantees to be able to bear the cost of that better? The last two are some summary questions that we ask at the end of our survey. So of all the things that you go through, what are the most significant challenges you face as grant managers in performing your day-to-day activities? And we see, typically in the last couple of years, we've seen funding uncertainties to be the highest. However, the good news is that this year it's not the biggest challenge. Obviously, this survey was done around the fall of 2019, so perhaps there was not going to be uncertainty for this particular fiscal year, and that's why the answers changed. But what we have seen this year is the highest value is around, the biggest challenge is around inefficient and bureaucratic processes. So what does that mean? Which processes are inefficient? What are we going to do to streamline them? Is it again a skill set challenge? Is it a data entry issue? What causes these inefficiencies? What are these bureaucratic processes that need to be streamlined? Finally, the most successful or the factors that impact the success of an entity in grants management, as Jeff mentioned, the single biggest one is well-qualified grants management staff. However, contrasting that to some of the certifications and training that the same entities are reporting on, we think that there's a mismatch there. So what can we do to actually improve that skill set and qualifications for staff that work on these things? The other two that I'd like to call out that increased this year in terms of success factors is clear communication about the mission of grants. So we think that's encouraging that entities are communicating more, perhaps right from when they're soliciting these grantees to apply, throughout the award process, post-award, etc. So hopefully that means that the communication and outreach is improving across the community. And then the second one is the org structure to support agency-wide adoption. We have seen a lot of entities start to look at enterprise grant systems. So looking at structures and processes that work across the silos or the different groups and offices in an entity is important here, because this is when you try to analyze whether a particular grantee is getting funds from multiple parts of the organization. How are they performing? Can we learn from each other? Can we reduce burden by streamlining some of the reporting and deliverables for that same grant? So it's encouraging that this particular factor is also improving over the years. Okay, with that, I will hand it back to Jeff to wrap up.
So I won't belabor the takeaways because I kind of started with them. There are one or two points though that I do want to make. The first is, we said, what do you think holds the most promise for dramatic improvement to grants management in the next 5 to 10 years? And we kind of thought, maybe some sort of new technology or some sort of new policy. What we were a little surprised by was that the single far and away most popular response was a desire for one portal for grant recipients. Which is to say, if you imagine that you were a county and that you were getting grant money from 2 or 3 different sources, a couple of state sources and perhaps 2 or 3 different federal agencies, there is a desire not to have a different computer system, a different login, different data format, different grant years for those different sources. There's an interest in having that be a unified portal to be less burdensome and require less technology interface. I was very surprised that actually the federal respondents thought this as much more strongly than any of the others. I was a little unhappy to see that kind of the artificial intelligence was at the low end, and that there were some things that were, I think, in the other category, the right end, that were interesting, which is people wanted to have a better demonstrated outcome learned from grant programs, so they want to be able to learn from each other. You've seen these takeaways, and we talked about them already, so I'm not going to belabor them. I did want to hit on a couple just of examples, and these were, again, kind of the open responses. And I apologize for having to flip through them, but let me mention to you the couple of 3 that I thought were most interesting in some of these buckets and categories. And one is, it's the first one under, under a user-centric focus. There was a suggestion that one of the things that someone was really proud that their organization was doing was intentional outreach and support to make sure grant opportunities are accessible and inclusive. And so really going out to seek and solicit new and different kinds of grant recipients in order to get new and different innovative ideas. And at the same time, kind of a couple of the 2 bullets below that, they were proud that they had changed the diversity of their panelists so that 75% or more represent communities of color. Now, I'm not sure, but I assume perhaps that was from an organization that's making grants to benefit communities of color or communities where people of color are a strong presence. So I thought those were interesting. And again, you'll be able to read these in full as you get the full slide sets. On the next slide, a couple of pieces of feedback that I thought were interesting were that States are, this is under kind of, they want a better way to capture and share lessons. The suggestion was states are laboratories of innovation, but the wisdom that comes from that experience is too often ignored or disregarded. I thought, again, that kind of symbolizes, hey, we could do a better job as a grant management community sharing the lessons about success and how that happens. In the middle column, there was an interest in strengthening the focus on outcomes, and this is kind of where we got specific suggestions. The second bullet says, allow visibility of financial and programmatic data together. Even if you haven't done a perfect job of matching, here's how much performance you got for how many dollars, present them at the same time, in the same place, and the same frequency so that you can see them together. And then the closeout, I like that there's a middle bullet there that says, a closeout should include a comparison of pre-award and final output data. You know, that's a relatively simple thing to do, and it seems to me like a great idea to say, once you're finishing the grant, was there an improvement from when you started on any metric, whether it be financial or performance or what have you? And then at the top right, one of the suggestions was kind of, again, a user-centric perspective across grantees, grantors. And here the question was, as a grantee organization, I would really like more consistency amongst the different grantors. Now, the problem I see with that is, if you say, for example, the agency that's hosting this HUD, do they coordinate very often with other agencies? In certain areas, yes. So, for example, I think many of us are aware of veterans homelessness. There's been pretty good coordination between the Veterans Administration and HUD and a number of local entities. But in other sorts of topic areas, is there really effective cross-agency coordination on a kind of a topic-by-topic basis, or especially on a kind of a grant community recipient basis? The answer from our respondents seems to say no. And so that's, again, something I think is probably kind of worth tackling. So the last, I want to touch on two on this last page. There is an interest in getting better technology, training people to use it, and bluntly, what I'm trying to read kind of between the lines is a bunch of grant recipients, and especially sub-recipients, say, this stuff is expensive, and we all kind of have a similar need, and we all have to spend the time figuring out which system to choose, pay for it, installing it, learning to use it, keeping up with it, and we can't ask our friend in the next county over how to use it because they use a completely different one. Maybe it would be nice if the grantor paid for a system and provided it to us, maybe even if they gave us a little bit less grant money. So I'm kind of reaching this conclusion that there were a lot of gripes about technology. It's not entirely clear what the answer or the solution might be, but there is some need for perhaps federal leadership to think about this in a way that both might reduce burden and improve efficiency by reducing the need for all the grant recipients and sub-recipients to spend separately on some of these things where they really have kind of a parallel set of needs. Not to say they should all choose, all the federal agencies should choose one, but perhaps they could coordinate and then conduct a competition and say, all right, well, here are 3 flavors, and let's provide the choice of which of those 3 flavors is of most interest to each of the grantees that we work with. So with that, that's the overview of the survey results. What I'd like to do now is invite our panelists to the stage. I'm going to introduce them as they come up. So panelists, if you would join us. These panelists are going to be ready to answer questions about and offer their interpretation of a number of the survey results. We invite you to ask them questions. I will ask them questions. No holds barred. They may ask you questions. I've told them that they're perfectly invited to do that because a number of you, again, are quite experienced and known in the field. Starting, let's see, with my immediate left, we have Heather Chase Alexander, who is the Director of Compliance at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. She is a biologist. She lives in Portland, Oregon. She came here for this event to help share her wisdom with you. And from a perspective of the whole panel, she represents nonprofits and to a significant extent both a grant recipient and a grant maker for organizations both receives and makes grants. To Heather's left, we have Cynthia Baugh. She is a member of the Senior Executive Service. She is currently the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Office of Federal Assistance Management at HRSA. Cynthia is unusual because prior to a grant-making role at HRSA, she had a grant management role at the Department of Agriculture, a grants management role at the Department of Homeland Security, a grants management role at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So she has a good knowledge of what's going on in a lot of different federal agencies, relatively heavily from the financial perspective, but not exclusively. To her left, we have Tiffany Kesslar. Tiffany is a Vice President of the National Grants Management Association. Now, I tease her, she's on the panel because she's here to represent the grantees who need to say critical things about the way the federal government works, but don't want to get blamed for it individually and lose their grants. So she's here representing the National Grants Management Association and offering the perspective of grantees. But to be honest, Tiffany has actually a day job in real life as well, and in that role she is an attorney, and she provides assistance to a variety of grant recipients, helping ensure their compliance, helping them address and deal with and prepare for audits, helping them think about and address training issues as well. And then finally, at the left side of the panel, last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Sylvia Fisher, who is responsible for the Office of Plan, Analysis, and Evaluation at the Health Resources and Services Administration. If I didn't
Not
mention...
true.
Sorry?
No.
No? I'm sorry.
No, my boss would.
Sorry, that's my boss. I apologize. But Sylvia brings an interesting perspective because she's responsible not so much for the financial side, but for are the grants actually achieving the outcomes we want, and a kind of a program evaluation side. She has previously served roles in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So she is going to provide a perspective kind of a little bit from the program evaluation and outcome side as well. But as I've suggested them previously, they are welcome to offer whatever perspective they like on whichever of these topics they like, and you are as well. So with that, what we'll do is we'll kind of start back at the beginning, and we'll go through as fast or as slow as you like. I've got a number of questions for panelists in each instance, and again, I invite you to ask questions as well as we go. So the place I want to start is, let's do that. This is the speaker that's connected to the camera. This is the speaker that's connected to the camera, so it allows the people who are not able to be here in person to hear. Okay, so the first topic area is, Okay. The first topic area was how grant managers spend their time. And so as I kind of foreshadowed, they're spending a lot of time on administrative compliance. Is this a problem? Can we do something about this? What would you suggest? And let's maybe ask if Tiffany, since you're again kind of representing some of these grantees and have some experience with their compliance, do you want to start? And anybody else who would like to is welcome to jump in.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
The first thing, when we actually break down this chart, what I did is actually group together what I thought seemed to be more administrative versus programmatic. And we actually, as a panel, discussed the fact that there is no clear definition of what would be an administrative or a programmatic cost. There's certainly a lot of gray area. We talked about whether or not that's something that we would ever seek clarification on. Personally, I don't think we would see clarification on that because it's too gray, right? You can be a program administrator, right, and be purely programmatic, though you are called an administrator, though maybe some of the things you seem to do seem administrative in nature. If we look at these categories, I see monitoring financial data, monitoring non-financial, but then we look at program policy and design, evaluating program, monitoring grantee programmatic outputs. For me, it ends up almost being a 50-50 split. Pretty clear, right, for different avenues, but I'm not sure that that's an inappropriate split. For a couple of reasons. I think that most agencies now, while we have seen a programmatic focus under the Overall Grants Guidance, and we see that even strengthened under the proposed revisions, it's very clear that there's a balance between programmatic outcome and compliance. And I think that there has to be a healthy balance there, especially because when we look at fraud, waste, and abuse, it's not in, we took money and didn't spend it right so that we would have this significant increase in program outcome. Right? It's we took money away because we stole it or we embezzled it, right? It wasn't for the better of society often. So we do have to have these strong internal controls in place from an administrative standpoint and from a financial standpoint to make sure we're maintaining that balance. It seems high, but I think when you kind of take a step back, it may not be an inappropriate balance between the two. And I think that the focus on performance and outcomes is positive in many ways, but it's never going to detract from our administrative side, from the need of having those controls in place to make sure we have control over our funds to try to reduce that fraud, waste, and abuse that we've continued to, I think, chase over the years and continue to reduce. So I'm not sure it's as unequal as it seems.
Okay.
Okay, I'll jump in from a federal perspective.
like when you ask, is this a problem, I can say the answer is yes and no. Because when you look at the life cycle of the grant, post-award administration, they're where you spend most of your time. So that's what makes you focus on compliance. I was a little surprised to see that on the financial side, they felt that was more of a burden than programmatic, because I see them working hand in hand, of course, post-award management, like you just said. But one of the things I want to focus on, I think people feel that way because on the financial side, you actually have more data. When you do your financial report, people actually feel like, okay, I have to track that. That's more of a burden. Some institutions may do this on a monthly basis, do their reconciliations, so they can do their annual financial report. So they may feel by doing that extra data, it is additional burden. But in the federal government, we are doing something about it. I can mention one agency, I know USDA, they have a portal with self-reporting for your financial report where they actually pre-populate some of the fields. So when you go to do reporting, you don't have to fill in all the fields for you. You'll have to complete your expenditures, your unobligated reporting, and also your liquidating. But actually, they do some pre-population, so that kind of helps reduce the burden. And when you think about the federal government as a whole, the Data Act, we're doing a lot to streamline and reduce the amount of reporting. And just recently, in December, when the GREAT Act was signed into law, that's a significant piece of legislation. The overall goal is to reduce the amount of data that people are going to have to do and get more consistent. Because right now, the data standards are kind of all over the place. So from a federal government perspective, we're working with inside of HHS and other agencies to come up with some standard data. So when somebody asks you what is causing this compliance, is it an issue? We don't know, because everybody may be talking apples and oranges, so we don't know the exact language. So when we get some standardized data, I think that would be the better picture.
So do you think we'll see reduced administrative time spent on administrative requirements when the Data Act is fully implemented?
But that is the hope. If we have the OIT, I think information technology, that consistency, that's what we need. Because a lot of the reporting, especially on the programmatic side, is like captured in narrative. So when someone's reporting, there's not data fields where you're pulling that information. So right now it's very subjective the way the information comes in. So once we develop some standards across the board, people know what we're expecting. I think over time you'll see some reduction, but I don't think it's going to be a immediate reduction.
Let me ask a toss-up question, having read all the open response items. One of the open response items said, yeah, for big grant recipients, the structure we have makes sense. But you know, some of us are pretty small. Maybe you should have relaxed requirements for some of the administrative reporting for small ones. What do you think? Should there be a threshold? Should there be relaxed requirements in any sort of administrative way for small organizations?
I'll just start by saying I think that reporting is clearly something where we've heard complaints across the board, right? That agencies obviously feel that they're reporting the same data over and over in different ways. I'm not sure there's anything we can do to get around that. I mean, another example would be FAFATA, right, which is based on the certain size agreements and I've heard nothing but complaints about the process and how it's uploaded and the difficulty people had with not being able to upload the data, right? I'm not sure that the issue is necessarily based on size in the fact that I think a bigger organization is going to have more reporting than a smaller organization just by definition of the amount of money or grants or the thresholds that have to be met. But I think that's always a goal. I'm just not sure if that in itself would be enough to relieve the burden.
And I think we're going to find that a lot of this is around issues of technical assistance and training and supports. That's what's going to be necessary to be able to help the smaller, perhaps newer grantees. I don't think you're going to be able to take away the reporting demands. Now, first of all, we'll be talking about this more, but people say, oh yeah, we want a common portal. Well, grants.gov gets more complaints than any portal that I know about. I know I shouldn't say that, but it's the truth. It gets a lot of complaints from grantee applicants. Once you have a common portal, it becomes very, very cumbersome. So that's a challenge. But we're not investing, in my opinion, enough on TA that help newer grantees. And that training is valuable. If not, if you lose the requirements, they're not going to have the data they need later when they apply for additional grants. They're going to be in a weak position.
This is the last question, which is, in a lot of instances, everybody recognizes that the grant recipients complain and the feds say essentially we can't do anything about it from the administrative side, but basically there are a lot of different grant programs, most of them legislatively authorized, surprise, surprise, and a lot of that legislation has in it some requirements about what kinds of people or agencies or organizations are eligible and what they must report and what the objectives of the program are. And so essentially kind of the local recipients say, we hate all this administration, and the federal executive branch says, our hands are tied for law. Is there some need for some sort of reconciliation of laws to say, hey, maybe we need to make some changes to laws to better streamline them? We kind of had 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's maybe try and organize them into a garden that looks nice. Would that make sense?
I think that would make sense, but until that changes, from a federal government perspective, we still have to adhere to the current laws that are in place.
Yeah.
So until that happens, we can get more outreach, more technical assistance, try to simplify things, but right now, our hands are kind of tied until those laws actually change.
Should that sort of kind of maybe on a topic area by topic area basis, should that be a priority for Congress? Is it a high priority, low priority, not at all?
I'm like that. Yes, Congress, please be clearer.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Done.
you know, right? Perfect. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but like, I think that's right. That's the problem. I mean, right? I'm a lawyer. Statute's super clear, really easy to understand, right? Very helpful. You know, and then you have regulations to try to clarify those, and then of course now there's a big issue with guidance and what even that means. But yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, sure, Congress would streamline and clarify and make the laws easier to understand. But I also think there's dissonance from the grantee side, what we see a lot, and I think we saw this with UGG changes actually, which is when the laws are streamlined so much from their very constrictive past to a very flexible new standard, everyone freezes and has no idea what they should do. Time and effort, for example, right? I know, like the dark cloud, but it went from a very prescriptive rule to a very flexible rule, and most agencies are following the old rules. They are terrified of what a new rule could possibly do. So I think there's a difficulty there as well.
Okay, so we have a question. Bassam, did you still have a question? What I'll ask is if one of you would repeat the question so that we can actually capture the microphone for people online.
So I don't remember which your survey this question was, but it basically dealt with the reason there's an administrative burden is because we're spending more of the grant dollars on administration than to actually achieving the mission of the grant award. So should there be a requirement when the award is being made that X portion gets allocated towards administration and the remainder is towards the grant's mission, achieving the mission. So maybe that might help grantees better manage the award.
I'll just repeat the question. So I think to summarize your question, it's would it be more beneficial if grants had a limitation or cap on administration so that more funds or majority of the funding would go towards programmatic outcomes? Is that a fair?
I mean, I think that goes back to what we've been talking to. This is so complicated how you even define what administration is. The variables there really impact the data, and what are we really getting from the data if we aren't sure about the true integrity, if everyone's responding to a different definition of what administration is. And then similarly, the type of grant that you're administering, whether it's federal, state, non-federal, the type of work you're doing, that adds a whole other level of variance that it may cost way more to manage an award because it's very contract heavy or state monitoring heavy as opposed to you actually implementing it. So it may be very appropriate for your administrative costs to be 5% or 10% or 50%. So, I mean, I think we all would love to know. I know at our organization, it's always been a green metric of what does it truly cost to administer an award, and it's a moving target, and it's really complicated. So, yeah, that would be fantastic. But I think there's a lot of challenges there.
Although one thing we do see is there are a lot of grants that do cap admin, but it doesn't cap the work, right? It just caps the money towards the work. And I know we're going to talk about that in a later slide, but then you get into a debate of, well, my agency only has 2% to do all of these tasks. Your agency has 15%. So clearly now we are going to have different processes, and whether or not that's good or bad, right, is up for debate.
And I mentioned when you talk about caps, I know some agencies do put a cap on a lot of the grants, but sometimes that limited from their office-sponsored programs. Actually, they're going to come in, so they may go for the dollars where there's a higher overrate, so they can do some of the things they can do. So sometimes it can impact the program and it can discourage people from applying when it actually does a administrative cap.
So let's move to the training topic. And again, here, there are a relatively small proportion, about 40% of agencies or respondents indicate their agency requires training. 60% has no requirement, and very little requirement for certification. Is this a problem? And if so, how or where or who should make training requirements? Maybe, Cynthia, could you start from a thorough perspective?
Well, from the federal perspective, I can tell you I have lots of grants experience, but I don't have a certification in grants management. I have a certificate. I've worked at various federal agencies, and a lot of agencies focus on core competencies. What are your competencies in the agency to doing the grant? But right now, we're trying to look at, I know currently at HHS, different agencies, they have their own certification programs, so we're working with the department to try to find some consistency across the department. So I think right now, to say that there's no training, that's not accurate. There is training, but it's not consistent training at the federal level among different agencies. And like if you move from one agency to that, it should be a standard level of minimal competency you should have as a grants manager. And right now, we don't have that. So by working at various agencies, I've actually seen the disparity from agency to agency. In my background, I spent a lot of time in contracting. So I think people are kind of looking for what you see in the contracting world, procurement. I have different levels, different requirements of certification, so no matter where you go, you have that. And I think the grants world is struggling to get there because it was in recent years, we just got our own professional series, 11 and 9 series. So I think it's going to take a while before grants get there, but I think all of the agencies are looking at ways to try to standardize, come up with core competencies, so eventually we can get to that. To say one day if we're going to have actually a certification program where you can move around with government agency to agency, that would be good, but we don't have that yet. And hopefully we can get some additional guidance or what we need to maybe direct in a certain direction what the agencies may need to do.
So I heard there's this thing called a Federal Acquisition Institute for procurement. Should there, and you say, good idea, not there yet. Should there be a Federal Grants Institute?
So at GMA, we have a Certified Grants Management Specialist certification. I've actually just recently taken it. I've been in practice for 14 years. Honestly, I just wanted to see what the exam was like. And I studied. I was nervous. Not since the bar, by the way, for those. And passed. But, you know, what's interesting about the slides is what is the number one deficiency? Unexperienced personnel. What is the number one success? Experienced personnel, right? Qualified personnel. I think there's no question that training is key. I think requiring a certification or encouraging it is also key because when you have a certification, for example, the one even that NGMA does as a nonprofit, you have to have 20 hours of CPEs at least a year, 60 hours of certification over a 3-year period to remain active. CPEs, what did I say? Oh, I'm sorry, continuing professional education credits, right? Now, most certifications have a requirement like this, and that requires each person to stay on top of what the law is, what the changes are. I mean, I do trainings regularly, and I've had people now say, when did this UGG, is this new? And you're like, well, new as of 2015, right? Not really new, and before that, there were laws that still existed. I think that it really needs to be a requirement. We're seeing states now make this, if not mandatory, giving raises or salary bumps because of it, making it contingent, strongly encouraging it. There's enough resources out there to do it. If it's going to be one of the number one controls, one of the strongest successes, one of the largest weaknesses, agencies really need to focus on training and some evidence of that, either through a certification or some cert. There's various organizations. I do know that there are some federal agencies that do say we want you to receive these types of certifications, but I don't think they have the breadth of ones that are available out there. But you know, a 2-day training can turn your staff knowledge around exponentially. I just don't think that it's something that can be optional.
Just one quick observation, I see this question. A lot of people who are working at the local level, state level grants, are experts in their content area or the issue that they're addressing. They're using maternal mortality, or they're using, child abuse prevention. So I think that there's not a good PR effort to get people on board within their professions to understand what they need to do to manage a grant, because they come in as content experts or high, strong advocates for important matters. And I think that we need to maybe do some outreach with associations and the professional fields for people about grants management as a general rule. I know that's a big kind of goal, but I feel like we haven't done any of that outreach in any way. So you can be a physician and not necessarily, you can be a direct physician or a pediatrician and not necessarily understand management grants. And nobody in the American Association of Pediatrics is going to tell you that you need something to think about.
Question, yeah.
The question I have is related to the sort of behind the scenes on the responses to this question. Was it predominantly responded to by federal agencies, by award-making agencies, or was the response more heavily weighted from the recipient?
We found, and I don't have the specific breakdown, although we can probably get that within 24 hours pretty easily. We found this was across the board, and that, in fact, my suspicion, without certainty, is that there are more folks who reported training and certification at the state level than at the federal level. At the federal level, there are a few agencies that really strongly encourage it, and there are other agencies that just don't focus on it. But I think the kind of the dynamic I'm imagining, I don't know if this is true, is at the state level, your certification may help you get more money. On the local level to a certain extent as well. And so you're all about trying to get more grant money, and therefore you may be a little more likely to be certified, whereas at the federal level, it doesn't really impact your ability to succeed in capturing resources for your mission.
Yeah, I guess to Sylvia's point, it's where the recipient community, where does that skill set live, and should it live with a subject matter expert, or should it live with, I'm not sure it varies by organization to organization, the size of the organization, so on and so forth, but that training looks different to the recipient than it does to the agency's award grants.
One of the things that NGMA's membership is pretty diverse across the country, the state level, local level, nonprofits, community-based, faith-based institutions of higher ed. One of the struggles we've had is major cities, especially in DC, there's not a lack of training opportunities in DC. It's across the country where we see the lack of opportunity. What NGMA has been trying to do is use even its new chapters and use its membership to go out in the field and provide training. And where we're seeing a lack of training isn't in the program area, but it's in like the UGG cross-cutting areas, what your single audit covers, what your financial statements are going to cover. Things like, if you ask most people, do you understand what a conflict of interest is? They're not going to have the right answer. They don't understand what a gratuity is. They don't understand what a problem with that is. They don't understand a period of performance, why that matters programmatically. So it is about reaching that opportunity to inform them of cross-cutting issues and why they affect the program. And once we've had that opportunity to get out there and do that training, to local governments, to the faith-based, the community-based, it's like all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. And I think one of the disconnects is a lot of people go out for grants, they get grant writers, or they go out for grants because they see the money and that they want to do good, but they don't fully have any understanding of the financial responsibility behind that. And that's where we see a lot of the grants fail.
I have a question for you. When you think about it, you just took the certificate.
And I was nervous, I passed.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So let's say if I did it at HRSA, and if I have 200 plus staff and I want them on there, it becomes a resource because it's not free, correct?
No, because it's a formally proctored exam, and NGMA doesn't even give the exam. It's proctored by a third party.
And the challenge is a lot of times you need to have the resources to go about that. A lot of agencies, they want to pursue it, but if you have a whole staff, like how can you don't have the resources to be able to do that. So that's one of the big challenges in the federal government. If we wanted to do that, it's the time it takes away from actually processing the board. You have to do it in some type of staggered approach, and actually you have to have the resources to be able to do it.
Right. But and what I would sort of counter to that is training is a resource, right? It's very rare to find free training opportunities that really dig into the areas that you need. But if we're going to look again, these are our biggest areas of weakness, and they are also our highest areas of success, there is an investment that has to be put into the training. And I mean, as the vice president of MGMA, I can tell you it's a very good value. It is reasonable and necessary.
Well,
Look at this. You like that?
well, to second that too, I do think it is an upfront cost, But the inefficiencies and the costs down the road that you save by not having inexperienced or people trying to navigate something, it's huge. And I mean, I think we've seen, at least as a pass-through entity, we work with about 15 different federal agencies. And the resources that individual agencies have been making to us and to our recipients, whether it's in-person 2-day trainings or different website resources, webinars, et cetera, it has increased significantly. What makes me sad, though, is I feel like we're all doing it in different silos. And we're all interpreting the same legislation, and if we could have a little more collaboration and centralization, it wouldn't be as costly for every agency to absorb those costs as well.
Right. In fact, I just did a 2.5-day training on the Uniform Grants Guidance in MGMA. It's our GM Baugh training, our grants management body of knowledge training. And the attendees, there were about 150, were from different federal agencies, as well as nonprofits from around the country and state and local governments. And half of the conversation was about those issues. Well, this is what we have in our notice, and we didn't think about that. And another person saying, well, we're actually doing that. And again, it was an opportunity for people to collaborate with one another, and everyone walked away learning something. So from your most experienced to your new hires, all of us need that training. I go to training. I'm assuming all of us do, right? It's how we all stay on top of these issues and continue to learn. So no one really should be outside of that. Even though I am a trainer, I go to trainings, right? As all of us should, to make sure we're all staying abreast of the newest issues. So it is truly an investment in your organization.
So, to keep things moving and see if we can get to kind of cover the across the waterfront, let's move on to the administrative spending topic. And there were a couple of questions here. Kind of one of them is, this is a lot of variation in administrative spend, from 2% or less to more than 20%. So the first question will be, is it real? And the second question is, what can be done about it? What should a grant maker do about it? What could a grant recipient do about it? And again, you can feel free to draw on your own organization if you like, or a little more abstract if you like. And feel free to ask questions to the audience as well. Cynthia, does this seem real to you? You're kind of a financial lawyer.
To me, it is real, but I guess one of my common questions, like, what is the definition? What are we defining this administrative spend across the board? And I think when I saw the 2%, that seemed to be a little low for me. 2 to 5% maybe in the average, but it makes you realize if someone said 2%, what are they sacrificing? Are they not doing training for their staff, that we just talked about that was very important? Are we not doing outreach and technical assistance? Are we not traveling with the program counterpart? What are we missing if we're down to 2%? Or maybe they're very efficient, I don't know. I would like to have more insight and learn at the lower levels for federal, 2% actually what they're doing and see what sacrifices they're making.
So one of the things we didn't represent on the graph, but we can, and I'll tell you here now, is for federal agencies, the average was about 10.6%. I'm sorry, not average, the median. For local agencies, it was about 8%. For states, it was about, I think it was 10.1%. And for nonprofits, it was about 7%. So kind of between 7 and 10% was the median for administrative spend for all these agencies. And I kind of compared that in my own mind to, if I give money to a nonprofit, I'd like at least 90% of the money to go to that nonprofit's program, and less than 10% to go to administration and fundraising. If it spends half the money on fundraising, I'm not going to give any of my money. And so my thought was, do we have something similar? It turns out we do. That 10%, 7 to 10% is kind of, again, the median. And the question is just these outliers. And so, Cynthia, you suggested, well, maybe it's not such a good thing to be down low, because maybe you're not actually overseeing the program well, maybe you've got big risks, maybe you're not providing technical assistance and kind of sharing knowledge and lessons and helping maximize program impact. Does anybody else want to jump in on this?
I think the struggle is real. I think there's a fine balance between being able to implement programmatically and stay in compliance and administer. I don't think you're going to get away from that. Where we've found probably the best ways to ease the pain potentially is really solidifying policies and procedures and having systems that support it, where you can create efficiencies in that administrative side, or offer trainings, have compliance requirements up front, have it as consistent as possible across programs, across partnerships. I think it's more about trying to find those ways to create efficiencies than fool ourselves into thinking that we're going to change when those requirements are necessary. I mean, we have a true fiduciary responsibility and accountability for these funds. I don't think that we can throw that out and just say, hey, put more money into the outcomes. I think we have to have those key controls. So that's where I think I believe with our team, and we work in the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, I find the same struggles that I think everyone finds as grantees within our own staff, that kind of between program staff and compliance staff, and just constantly feeling like they're bogged down with the compliance side. The best thing I think we can do is continue to have training, education, let people understand what is the context for these requirements, why they're important, and then develop procedures and systems that make them as easy as possible to comply with.
And I would like to see a platform where you can kind of share some of the best practices, because I've had an opportunity to go out to a lot of the grantees and find out what are your pain points, and then I was like, can you give me some suggestions? What are the things that are working? So I think if we had an open public platform to share best practices with some of the agencies and institutions are doing, I think that would be very important.
And to add to that, I think one of the things that the foundation has implemented is just surveys to our grantees at certain points of the process to say, okay, we've gotten through your grant. How much time did you actually spend on reporting? How much time did you spend trying to navigate the system? How much time did you spend here? So there's a constant feedback loop of where we can see sort of where the weaknesses are. I don't know on this scale, given the different types of funding and the different types of the vast audience that we can do it, but if we wanted to refine these questions to try to focus in on some of the more specific administrative requirements to truly identify how much time is being spent, maybe we could get a little bit more targeted data where we can target improvements.
Yeah, I think that would be particularly helpful because reporting, I think, is where we hear a lot of the complaints. But, monitoring is an administrative piece. So are you monitoring through desk audits? Are you just looking at single audits? Are you actually going on site, which I think is the missing piece with a lot of agencies that don't have the funds available. They won't be due on site unless there's already an issue or, right, they don't have that sort of risk-based process. So I think that would be particularly helpful because I do feel like when you have more funds that maybe you do have a more robust monitoring process. Someone can't get on site though, request a lot of documentation, so there's more administrative burden before, say, reimbursement or advanced processes. So I think that would be helpful to write that down.
So one of the things I'm kind of hearing maybe is, the folks who spend more money may be doing a little more on-site monitoring and providing a little higher level of technical assistance. And the folks who, for either their own choice or perhaps the choice of the grantor, spend less money, may not be kind of achieving that level of kind of program monitoring, technical assistance, and perhaps program improvement. And then, of course, the next question in my mind would be, well, is the money worth it? Are the programs that are up in kind of this range, are they achieving a higher level of performance? Which, again, I think is a little challenging to determine right now. So let me ask, there are kind of two next steps I imagine as possible hypotheses. Tell me whether or not these make sense. One of them is, as the GREAT Act and the data standards that OMB and HHS are defining come out, they're primarily about kind of what sorts of things are we going to bucket together as a cost in terms of, whether it be fringe benefits for salaries or whether it be travel or what have you. But it's not at this stage trying to kind of set out an apples-to-apples cost comparison for a lot of financial pieces of data. It hasn't yet said, all right, well, let's define some of those administrative words, define, here's how we're going to identify administrative costs. Would it be useful to try and say, let's get a clear definition of administrative costs so we could actually gather this data and make sure it's on an apples-to-apples basis in the future? Would that be worthwhile?
I think that would be helpful because you'll have a better direct correlation, because right now, you see the ones that are spending more, so if they're not getting any better product, the outcome out of spending more, then they get to maybe they need to look at maybe reducing that and find a happy medium. So you may make a recommendation on average maybe 8 to 10% is like where those need to be, some type of goal post so federal, state, and local agencies know what to try to aim for.
Yeah. Simply had a reaction that Sylvia does too, at least it looks like.
Well, what I immediately, again, kind of went to the UGG where it talks about direct and indirect, where it says purely administrative, clerical work should be included in, as an indirect cost unless it can meet certain requirements. And it designates what the 4 requirements are, that it's in your budget, that it's clearly articulated, that it's ancillary to the program, and it has a direct benefit, it is not already an indirect cost rate. I am hesitant to clarify administration, and most statutes and regulations actually don't do it, I think, with purpose. Because when you do have a cap or you do have a limit on admin, I think there are enough programmatic responsibilities that can be deemed to be programmatic costs, that if you try to not make that as gray, I think, and it might end up being potentially programmatic as far as how funds can be spent to achieve those requirements anyway. Especially with indirect costs or agencies that are required to have restricted indirect cost rates. You already are significantly limited in what you can apply from an administrative standpoint. So, you know, I'm a lawyer, I live in the gray, right? So,
Well, one of the areas where I see some conflict, like look at total direct costs, in some areas it's silent. You will have some entities that may try to double dip. You have that where on certain programs they're using direct costs and then somewhere else, you know, it's not a direct cost and it's an indirect cost pool. So I can see both sides of the coin, but it's like we gotta try to close those loopholes because a lot of times you would assume it's direct cost. When you look, someone may be in the cost pool of indirect, and yet the limitation, the caps you put in place may not directly address that. So that's something we need to think about as well.
oh yeah, so do you think that's lack of training of understanding the indirect cost negotiation, or it's like actively double dipping?
I think in a few cases it may be actively double dip, but I think training and education around that. Because when you talk about indirect costs and negotiations, a lot of people, their eyes just roll in the back of their
They
head.
have no idea what's
But
happening.
I think it may be a few individuals that realize that there may be a small loophole there, and they feel like, okay, they're only looking at direct costs. And then if I put this in my indirect cost pool, but you should be using consistent treatment across the board with all the other direct programs. A lot of times when you go out, you're looking at that one program, you're not looking at all the programs, and actually when you go out and do that financial assessment.
So unfortunately, my colleague Kathy Newcomer from George Washington University had to step out for a conference call briefly, but let me ask, in her absence, on her behalf, if George Washington University were to say, hey, this would be a really interesting area for some sort of evaluative research, and perhaps kind of digging in with careful cost accounting to the basics to try and learn something about some of the big spenders and some of the frugal folks. Do you think that that would be a worthwhile kind of focus of research by someone who's independent and not, again, trying to kind of either get more money for administrative purposes for their grant program or trying to kind of minimize expenses from the federal perspective? Is there a room and a worthwhile benefit from that?
I still work on benefit, yeah. I totally agree. And if I could get you a chance to say that I'm the director of research and evaluation at HRSA. Okay, Cynthia's from. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one thing that if you operationalize, I think it's said here, not everybody knows what the different columns mean. They're not well defined. There's not always clarity. I think sometimes even the monitors, the project officers who work with the grantees aren't always sure what qualifies in direct costs and so on. I mean, there's got to be training at all levels. If you're going to put in the survey, I think you need to provide excellent definitions, lots of clarity, examples, but I think it would be worth it for the grantee community. And I think as you ask those kinds of questions, the conversation changes a little too. This has got to be better designed, monitored, operationalized, and the data used to inform future grantee practice.
And the only study I know about currently that dealt with the percentage of administration is the Government Accountability Office, but it's been over 10 years, did a report in the U.S. Department of Education on the percentage of administrative costs in the Title I program under No Child Left Behind, which is the largest funded program under what's now the Every Student Succeeds Act, and came up with a 10% average. So I'm not sure if other studies have been done, but I know at least there was one on what they found to be an average or appropriate administrative amount.
So other studies have been done, and always been able to track and report accurately. And so the report that we weren't able to monitor and exactly track these things. That happens. It's happened a few times.
I have to say this aside, very selfishly and nervously, I looked at a couple of REI clients who responded to this survey to see did they report themselves being big spenders or frugal or in between. Interestingly, several of them were at the very frugal end, which pleased me because it means that they're not spending so much on REI that they've turned into a big spender. But it still left me with the kind of uncertainty we've been talking about, which is I don't know whether they've really kind of captured all of what I might consider as administrative costs. And I think it may be a little clearer, for example, when I give money to the American Cancer Society, how much money are they spending on fundraising and on, their own employees versus how much are they giving to, research universities doing clinical trials with cancer, treatments. And so it's a little clearer, I suspect, in that arena. But the thought was, a lot of people are familiar with this kind of thing in the nonprofit and donation, the charitable donation arena. And I think there's a lot of room for growth and improved knowledge and perhaps some action in government frankly in business. Seems to be good. Okay, let's move on.
Jeff, there's a question there.
Oh, I apologize.
Just a quick question. In the underlying data, was there a category that lists how much grant dollars the agency spends or the grantee is getting?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What we did, we had a series of 3 questions, and this was the last. The first question was, how much money does your agency disperse each year in terms of grants? And we had buckets, so it was 1 to 5 million, 5 to 10 million, 10 to 25, and so forth. And then the next was, what is your organization's administrative budget and or spend? Presumably you spend most of your budget. And again, it was kind of within buckets, 0 to 1 million, 1 to 5 million, 1 to 2.5, I think 2.5 to 5, and so forth. We kind of couched those questions to help set the framework in people's minds. And the third question, we didn't try and calculate, either based on those first 2 or on any sort of review of their actual financial reports. We simply asked them, as the third question, what percentage is of the annual value of grants processed by your organization does your organization's administrative budget constitute? Now, we've hopefully gotten into the frame of mind of those 2 figures with the previous 2 questions, but again, we just took what they said to us, which is they said 0 to 2%, 2 to 5%, 5 to 10%, and so forth.
So was there a correlation between, say, like you said, the Cancer Foundation, which receives hundreds of millions of dollars in grant funding, just throwing out the number, are they spending more administratively to go and receive more grant funding versus, or is it a smaller mom and pop?
There was not a correlation between either the type of organization, federal, local, state, nonprofit, nor the size.
Okay.
So the larger organizations, there were a fair number of very large organizations that reported spending more than 20%. A fair number of very large organizations that reported spending less than 2%. So we did not find any correlation with respect to either size or type. Okay, let's talk a little bit about performance, then I'm going to turn it over to Bertruda for a couple of last. Do you want to? Oh, I'm sorry. So last couple. Okay, so on the performance topic, the question here is again, grants managers seem, many of them, nearly half, to either not be able to measure performance or to have their performance fall. And so the question is, why? Why don't they know? Why can't they measure? And should this be a priority to do something about it? Sylvia, do you want to kind of launch us from your perspective?
Yes, I have this is an area I work a lot with grantees directly and also with grant programs very directly. I think a couple of things. Number one, performance is not generally the same as outcome measurement. And so you have to think about what about that question. What is captured? I would not assume when you're asking about outcomes that that's a performance measurement kind of issue. And it's usually, and whether it should be or shouldn't be is another issue. It's often done almost as a different function from an evaluation perspective. Issue 1. Issue 2. We, in government, in federal government, we usually ask programs that we fund to provide evidence of outcomes. What we generally find, and it's only fair to be frank, is that grantees can provide output information. And that can include performance data. But it's like, how many people were served, how many did this, how many did that, how much money was spent per client or person served, and these kinds of data points, all of which have value, are important for managing the grant program, and do provide some insights into what you might want to do when you go back and when you ask for future years of funding, and how you're going to frame that ask, and how you're going to do that response via applications. But when we ask programs to do outcomes, we'll get, generally, lot of the grant programs that I've worked with, that's a number. We don't actually provide funding for outcomes. Outcomes are inherently designed to often occur after a program's funding is terminated or is completed. So what happens is, we say, we've invested right now versus doing a lot of investment in trying to reduce maternal death. Because there are a lot of deaths, particularly. Maternal mortality, can you hear me here? All right, how about now? Okay, so there's a lot of investment in that, and that has an outcome that we want to see, correct? We want to see fewer people die, fewer women die after, having a child or during a pregnancy. But we don't, we're providing programs to do outreach to communities that are having high rates of mortality and so on. However, some of those requests are around, who's getting served and so on, what services are being provided, how much they're costing. To see the actual mortality rate lower in the United States is going to take some time. Those grantees are not likely to see a very, very substantive difference at the national or perhaps even the local level. And the same is true. I worked a lot at one time with suicide prevention and how those programs work. Unfortunately, the suicide rates are going up, not down. So, but those outcomes occur usually long after those prevention programs are implemented with various at-risk communities or at-risk, populations. So, we are asking people to report on that when we don't provide them the funding to track their program's performance through the outcome stage. That's one of the reasons this is happening. Okay? So I think you have to be aware that that's a challenge. I feel it's very unfair. I work a lot with developing logic models, and I'm familiar with them, where you develop, how your plan is going to be structured, and how you're going to do what data you're going to collect, some of the performance data, and then what your outputs will be, and then what your outcomes will be. And sometimes the outcomes go 5 years beyond funding period. There's no way to track them. The program may not even exist. So, it's not a fair answer. The government does it all the time. We expect it of our grantees. So I feel this is a big, big challenge. On the performance end, yes, I think you can do a lot to improve performance. I think one of the things that we talked about is, can we make it an easy fix so that it's possible for performance to be tracked without too much administrative overhead or burden. I do feel that, anytime you do any additional asks, it's burden. Plus, there's, you don't have the training or the right personnel to be able to know what to do about collecting that performance data, then you're going to have challenges. It's going to incur costs, but it's going to incur time and it incurs training requirements. However, sometimes what we do is we do very simple performance measures so that we can, number one, ensure that grantees that don't have necessarily all of those kind of expertise in their local communities, for example, are able to collect some information. Okay, so that's going to be one reason we're using performance. The performance and evaluation world doesn't always mesh, but it's possible to collect a lot of performance data if you have, up-to-date systems. You get the technical support from the grant program and your project officers who are working with you from the granting awarding agency. So I think that it's not going to be very simple to reduce the compliance burden, but I think it would be helpful if we change the expectations of the collection of the grantees so they can realistically address the questions and achieve at a minimum outputs and outcomes that we're seeking.
It strikes me as something that kind of response is very empathetic to the interests of the grant recipients.
Yeah.
Although you're from the federal side, I wonder whether or not somebody from the grant recipient side, Tiffany, or perhaps others, wants to offer any thought or perspective.
It's also methodologically correct. Yeah, so that's I'm very similar to grantees, but I'm also, from this methodological perspective, it's not fair what the expectations are. And then smacking the grantee and saying we can demonstrate the outcomes 5 years out.
No, so I'm going to say it's spectacularly unfair to the grantees. A couple of things here. I would say, number one, there are certain statutes, let's blame Congress, right, because they're not here, but they do set sometimes very unreasonable expectations. So I work a lot in education, and under No Child Left Behind, 100% proficiency with all students across the country before that law ended, and clearly that happened, right?
Funding was tied to that.
And funding was tied to that, but it was also a formula grant, right? So you can set expectations for performance in a formula grant, but there isn't necessarily the right to not fund those if performance expectations are not being met. So I think with formula grants, you have a unique difference in that we're setting performance measures, but there's not necessarily consequences tied when we're not seeing those measures being met. On discretionary grants, I think one of the difficulty with performance measures is we do have, what we see a lot is we have a grant writing office or external grant writers that are writing competitive grants because they want to win the funding. Sometimes what can happen is the funds are awarded and the awarding agency doesn't even sometimes realize what they have promised, right? Because it's been written by a third party or it's been written by an office who didn't communicate with the proper program office over what was going to be done, and we already have unrealistic expectations kind of out of the gate. I think the third problem is, the Uniform Grants Guidance, to its credit, brought in performance. The proposed revisions reinforce performance as a measure, also to terminate awards. But I think a lot of awardees were not familiar with setting performance measures, didn't know what those should look like, and in many cases can't. Research grants. How do you set a performance measure, right? If the goal is to do research, is my performance that I just did the research, right? And I think that that's a struggle. So when you're trying to create performance measures where none have existed in the past, is it really that you weren't successful, or was it that you said it wrong? You didn't know where that line should be. So I think there's struggles depending on whether it's formulaic, whether it's competitive, and on the type of grant we're talking about. And just because you're improving, very much to Sylvia's point, maybe not to the level expected, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been performance and improvement, maybe in ways that are immeasurable or not seen at the time. I do think, let's be honest, there's not enough money in grants. So people aren't going into grants just for the money, right? There is a goal of everyone to want to improve whatever the mission is. And I think that people are working towards that, and the majority of the people successfully, it's hard to better encapsulate, I think, and find where that progress is.
Two quick comments. One is, we're talking about performance and how to measure it, the actual measures that are used for performance. But we also have to talk about the target setting process and who sets the targets. The award, the grantor, or the local grantee. And the who sets the targets is a big point of discussion. It's very political at the local, federal, state levels, and it's a real problem in terms of one reason you might see this. These may, what we had before, it may be that some of those targets were not fair, realistic, or plausible, that there wasn't adequate funding to meet those targets. And those targets, that target setting process is very complex and often undersold to what sounds good and we think might be reasonable. That's one. Two, with the group, one suggestion I have for your next survey is the group that reports performance improved, find out why, what they did. What was it they know? How did they know it? And what did they do?
And if I can just add one other thing, I think one of the challenges, especially in the conservation world, that we have is we don't know if we're meeting outcomes for a very long period of time. So some of these changes that you're trying, the activities that you're putting in place, yes, we can say what our grantees have done, and we know those are the best practices that are associated with change in the environment. But there are so many factors also that contribute to that. There's so much adaptive management of the goal setting, the investment, like Sylvia mentioned too, the investment that you have to actually put up front to decide what is our goal, what is the desired outcome. Continue to watch that. And it may be 10, 20, 30 years sometimes before you see if this is effective. And it's definitely a challenge.
Well, and another thing I thought about too is when we're looking at performance, are we talking programmatically or administratively? Like, what if your performance this year was that you got all of your sub-grantees to timely spend, to not carry over, to have the documentation in place that they needed, which has, in effect, helped them become more efficient, reduce their administrative burden, right? Like, is that a measurement that we're using to say, well, yeah, maybe our performance has only slightly gone up, but now look how much more efficient we are. So we know now next year we'll be able to hit better targets too. So what are we talking about as far as type of performance measures?
I have one comment on that, but from a business point of view, like they're talking about performance on the programmatic side, but we use the notice of funding opportunity. When that is put out, we're looking for milestones to get you where you want to go. So the outcome, like, it may not come for 5 to 10 years, but you need to show some demonstration over time. Like if we give you a base award, continuous funding, you meeting those milestones and your base that you lead headed in the right direction. So from a business point of view, we just want to make sure that's in place. And then hopefully for the outcomes, we'll have performance measures to be able to capture that. But like over time, we just need to make sure you're going in the right direction and the dollars and the programmatic reports kind of line together.
And although you have to be a lot, that's a great question. There has to be a lot of thoughtful effort though, to link those performance indicators appropriately to prospective outcomes. A lot of times there's not a good degree of match. Performance measures are not a good indicator or helpful in projecting the outcomes. So that requires a lot of negotiation and thought.
One last thing I would mention is that in many cases, the performance data is not always appropriately gathered by the grant recipient. You might expect to report it. And we kind of spoke a little bit yesterday. I know a little bit about some of the activities that the Health Resources and Services Administration, which is two of you are part of, performs. And one of the things I was very impressed with is the percentage of babies who are born at low birth weight, which is a traditional sort of an infant kind of mortality risk, happens to be lower at clinics that are funded by HRSA than for the nation as a whole. And of course, some of that information is gathered by the clinics. They say how many babies were born and how many had low birth weight. But you actually haven't defined the measure yourself. That's actually something that's been defined by the Centers for Disease Control. And the ability to say, where does a HRSA outcome land is really important in the context mostly of what's the national figure. And that's from a CDC survey that kind of is, again, conducted across private hospitals, public hospitals, presumably some HRSA-funded clinics. And so we may not be able to expect either you or your grantees to kind of have that whole picture. But nevertheless, again, I was really impressed that actually serving some of the most disadvantaged populations, HRSA is actually achieving a better health outcome in that instance through its clinics that it funds than in fact is being achieved kind of by the nation as a whole. So, sorry.
Just a quick question about that. How many years have you asked this question, and are these results similar to what you've had? This question was asked.
2 years so far, before we've been doing the survey. The results are still about 50%. They're relatively the same. The only difference between last year and this year is that this year, slightly less than half of federal respondents indicated didn't know performance or it fell. Last year it was close to 60%, and the feds were kind of the worst of the bunch in terms of the fewest who knew performance or who said performance had improved, performance had fallen. Let me also make one more pitch, which is if you have suggestions for other questions to add to the survey in future years, please feel free to share them after the fact. And here's another question here, sir.
Yeah. With respect to the total number of programs, right, in terms of measuring the performance, is it a best practice or how many programs define performance metrics attached to milestone in order to get the payments out? Like a milestone, basically payments are driven by the performance metrics achieved by the milestone. Is that the common practice? I know that a lot of grantees, they have a direct drawdown and abilities to get the money, or some of the smaller ones, they apply, they send the invoices to get the money reimbursed, right? But is it a practice to define those metrics attached with performance? And is a common thing that's happening in terms of defining the milestones at the time of award?
So essentially the question was, do we see grants tying payments to performance measures, right?
Milestone,
to milestone performance measures.
So it's spin down indicative of performance.
And a lot of times it's not because we're looking at best effort a lot of times with the grant. So as long as you're making progress towards the goal, that's our program and the grants management specialist are close together. So we're working for progress towards that. So whether it's a grant or cooperative agreement, that's what we're moving towards. So it's not really tied to whether you get access, but for continuation of funding, we're looking for some specific amount of progress towards those goals.
I would also just add from like a subject grant monitoring perspective, the lack of spend down can be a red flag that obviously that things aren't happening. So while there obviously are going to be situations where cash flow is not an issue with a certain organization, and they may just choose to avoid the administrative burden of continually invoicing. It varies a lot with our subrecipients, but certainly we do have in place enhanced monitoring that's like, they're 50% through the project, but they haven't spent any money yet, so what's going on there? So it's certainly, for us, it's a monitoring tool, but I don't think we can make a direct correlation to say that it's absolutely indicative of performance.
I can actually also offer something here. Working with more than 40 grant programs, REI Systems has some experience. It's very unusual. I'm not familiar with a place where a grant program's funding is either contingent upon or tied to a particular performance outcome or milestone date. Now, the reason for that you might not be too surprised by once you hear it, which is those usually aren't grants. Those are usually either a cooperative agreement or a contract. So, for example, we work with a number of federal agencies that make small business innovation and research awards. They're like grants. They're basically to try and kind of advance scientific knowledge, perhaps produce a product or a service that will be useful to that agency, also create some jobs and some small business growth. And the bottom line is those actually take the form of contracts because there's a very clear expectation. You will do this, you will achieve that, and we will give you the money to do so. Now, there's not really kind of and you will deliver a certain product to us as a traditional procurement. It is more like a grant, but the legal form of it essentially is a contract, and in some cases, cooperative agreements are similar. So my experience has been, I haven't found that in grants. I have found that sort of thing in cooperative agreements and contracts that kind of behave like grants.
And I do think there are a lot of organizations that need the federal funds to even get off the ground and get moving.
Okay, we've got about a total of 15 minutes left. There are kind of just one or two other topics I wanted to hit quickly, and then we can certainly open it up for audience questions as well. So one last topic I really was interested in hitting was the question on the use of technology to satisfaction. Let's see if I can flip to that. So here the issue is that essentially kind of satisfaction with technology is low. And in fact, this is one of the, we gave kind of a 1 to 5 point scale. You know, how satisfied are you, how dissatisfied are you with a whole variety of different topics. We picked out and showed you just a few where people were either most satisfied or least. One of the ones with which people were least satisfied with was their ability to access technology, and even more so, the ability of sub-grantees to kind of cover the costs of reporting and to cover the costs and ability to use technology. So my question is, do you see this as a problem? Is there something you would suggest be done about it? Again, with this kind of subtext I'm reading between the lines of the sub-grantees say, hey, yeah, we'd really rather you just give us the technology instead of making us go buy it ourselves. Any thoughts about those topics?
Well, I think training is absolutely essential in any of these, anything, whether it's supplied by the grantor or the grantee at the local level. It has to matter. I mean, the truth is that I am, from a data perspective, I'm amazed that, with all of the online reporting and all the vehicles that are currently being used, how still there's so much trouble getting data reported in multiple opportunities that I've worked with and grantees. There just seem to be a lot of challenges. I know some of the communities are very low income and they don't have the expertise available within their communities to take the data that they need. So I found this a big issue. I'm not surprised that all the satisfaction with technology is low. The other thing is sometimes some of what we provide when we offer technology is not the most up-to-date, or there's so many security issues that have been embedded. I mean, I put like 4 things on this damn phone for work, okay? I mean, I have like 100 passwords for this stupid little phone, okay? I don't work for defense, paying is fine, but that's what you know what I'm saying? And so the point is that we add a lot of things to make them more complex systems, and then we don't provide the training to the local level that they need. And I think that has to do with this rate.
I mean, there are a lot of state agencies that still don't have online grant systems. So I hate to say it, I think it would be very hard practically, right? Each state, I mean, there are even just, forget the federal government, look at just state governments. There are some state agencies that use different systems than their other state agency counterparts in their local governments. that are the same. I joked with the panel yesterday, I want an Amazon for grants, where I just order my grant and 2 days later it shows up, at my house. So, but we all joke, like, can you imagine the security risks that would exist if all of the information? I even thought about how on my own computer I have so many passwords saved. It's such a horrible thing to admit, but I just click the button and the password just shows up. I don't even remember what they are half the time. And how dangerous that would be if all of the grant funds were tied to that. So I think it sounds like this idyllic utopia, but practically I just don't know how helpful or practical that would be.
Well, I think the cybersecurity issue, I think in recent years, I think that has made some agencies be a little bit leery about grantees accessing the information, because the information to go back and forth, you have to have a lot of security measures in place. And I don't think across the board we have that yet. So, because I know some grantees, they want to interface with us, and they can get information in real time, and with all the cybersecurity issues, we just can't allow that right now. But that's something to think about for the future.
So my last question for the panel, although certainly members of the audience, I would encourage you to ask questions as well. My last question is, inefficient and bureaucratic processes are one of the big challenges. What do you see as either a particular example of bureaucracy or a particular strategy to kind of reduce or avoid bureaucracy? Any suggestions that any of you would make?
I can start off with this. When I looked at these challenges, I kind of focused in on 3 of them that I thought that was, particularly from a personal point of view, that I thought was concerning. The one that deals with funding uncertainty. A lot of times when we put out our NOFOs, we'll put based upon the availability of funds in the federal government. That's just what we do. But for some grantees, it's really scary for them to start planning, not knowing if the funding is going to come. Because even though when a document is out there and then they may be assured that the funding is in process, it's going to come, but they're afraid to actually start making those connections. So when that award is actually made, they're already behind the curve as far as getting contracts in place. So that certainly slows it down. So a lot of times in the first year of the grant, you don't see a lot of activity because they didn't really start to actually get the notice of award in their hands. And another area is attracting well-qualified grant management staff. That can be challenging. I just found out, like, she's a microbiologist, I'm a microbiologist. So where do you go to find and train staff? And I think in this world, you need to kind of open up your eyes, because I think there's people that have potential to be well-qualified grant managers in various disciplines. And a lot of times people would think just business majors, but there's a whole gamut out there. And I think by opening it up, you may find people who are very adaptive, have an interest in grants management, and therefore you can get people who are very interested in the mission. That's one of the reasons I'm at HRSA, because I have a scientific background, I'm interested in public health, so I like to go in a place where I feel I'm connected to the mission. So with all the various disciplines out there, I think if you get those type of people, that's how you can get people that are energized, motivated, and they will become well-qualified grant staff and trained internally and also externally. And my last one is the risk of fraud. Even though that one is low, I think the risk of fraud, that's a really big challenge a lot of times with a lot of the recipients that we deal with, because some of them, they are so afraid because they may read an OIG report, a GA report, to really do something. And if they notice something that's not quite right, they are afraid to kind of reach out to the hotline and say, we don't think this is quite right. When they're protected, I mean, they don't see that. A lot of times when something happens and the interview stuff, they say, we realized that wasn't right, but we didn't want to reach out because they didn't want to, affect their institution. So the risk of fraud, waste of abuse, I think that is a big challenge in the bureaucracy, because they don't want to reach out and tell us some of the problems that they see. And I think in the long run, they get themselves in trouble. So those are the three, even though it was low on the totem pole, but for me, the risk of fraud and looking at enterprise risk management across the board, I think those are some things that concern me. And I think they have a lot of challenges across the board.
And just to speak to more bridging that gap, the disconnect between the agency priorities and those that are the grantee role. I mean, I think it's really interesting having been in the compliance role for, 3-4 years now. I'm short. In the compliance role, when we administer federal programs, we have a large programmatic staff that are very much in touch with the programmatic folks at the agency or the grantor. So there's this back and forth and this real collaborative relationship. But when you get into the administrative world and the compliance world, we're so siloed. And I think there's that audit relationship that you have to be careful of, right? That there's but there's also so much shared knowledge and ability to collaborate and understand the expectations that are coming from our funders. And in the last year, I found that we've built relationships with several of our agencies, and just participating on panels together or sitting down and talking about what our best practices are for Manasevit monitoring, I found that ourselves, as a pass-through entity, and the agencies are able to feed off each other and find more consistency. So I feel like bridging that gap more, and as we've also noted, like this brand desire for more of a one-stop shop as far as administration goes, I think there have been strides in the day that the Federal Audit Clearinghouse has just changed the way our shop is doing review of single audits and having access to information. More tools like that, more ability to utilize technology to share information and reduce some of the duplication, I think, in sharing knowledge about our cybersecurity performance or their controls. I just think there's a ton of opportunity for additional collaboration and reliance on systems.
And actually, to that point, I'd like to, we're talking about where the constraints are. I think one way that we can help streamline current processes is through what has now been termed blending and grading of funding. I don't think we see it enough, actually. So being at HUD, I want to talk, I immediately thought of Promise Neighborhoods. Right? I work in education, so when you talk about how you increase, student proficiency, it also brings into other areas like housing, like homelessness of students or nutrition, right, of students, and it brings in different granting agencies who have similar missions and goals. If we could truly blend those funds, so instead of dealing with what the Department of Education needs, or what Department of Agriculture needs, or what HUD needs, or Department of Justice needs with crime in the area, getting kids to school, letting them feel safe, if we could take the various grant funds and sit down at a table and say, this is what our new plan is going to look like, this is how we're going to spend all of this grant money, it's going to require flexibility on the part of each agency maybe to tweak a little bit of what the funding was needed for, but look what we can achieve if we do that. Now, we don't see as much blending of funding. We've seen it talked about. There's intergovernmental agency councils on this and how to do it, but practically we don't see it utilized, and it is because of a fear the auditor is going to come in and say, what did you guys do here, right, and not understand. But it's certainly something I think most agencies are willing to do and coordinate with, and it would absolutely help the grantees to take this money out of silos and be able to look at it from a bigger picture to help with the greater goal and help us increase performance.
I want to make a quick, I would say that's a good concept, but actually, I've been on a lot of compliance reviews, and when actually we go out, they do the blended grading, so when you ask them to ungrade and say, make sure the stream of money went to that activity, they can't do that. So we're going to have to
why ungrade if you're grading, right? I think that's that. Like from the grantee side, now you're telling me to ungrade it when you allowed me to. The whole point of the grading was to, right? I think that again, that's where the disconnect is.
Well, that's where the disconnect is. But when you look at it, let's say if I'm the Department of Ag, I'm giving you money for particular activity, and then HHS is for particular activity. You say, okay, I'm going to grade it for this other agency, but then some of the priorities we wanted you to accomplish, you didn't do it, and you didn't actually come to us and say that communication with the agency didn't happen. What you did was a really good idea, but actually, maybe the Department of Ag, they wasn't in that conversation when that happened. So the theory of it is good, but actually they went ahead and did something that was great. We said you didn't use those dollars for the activity that was perfect for. So I think what you're saying is a great idea, but I think educating them on how they can do it, how they can grade fund and address that, and actually get the agencies involved without them doing it on their own. I think that's a great way to go.
This is a macro conversation, but on a micro level, the things okay, so I come from a grantee agency, and we just do a lot of internal work. So we just did a survey, literally, just provided the reports for the administrator, survey of our grantees, and we found out what things can be done internally. People come to me and say, Sylvia, I need to know more. I'm in the OIT office where, I think grantees may have concerns about X, Y, Z. Ask them what we can do to make it better. And that's the whole goal of that effort. In other words, we're making a conscientious effort to work collaboratively internally and developing our internal innovations based on those results of the surveys, and then we're making internal improvements. And we have over the past several years, we've done this for 4 years now. And we actually apply it. And so you know what? Even on a micro level, it has improved some of the experience of those grantees around burden or access to different things that they need to get. in their engagements with the agency. And I think if there was a little more of that kind of effort, I think you may be able to make some inroads, even if it's only at the agency level, in working with their grantees.
So let me see whether the audience has questions on any topic, for either any of the panelists or for Richard.
Last one, I promise. When we were talking about technologies earlier, was there any specific technology, whether it was grants management systems or internal systems like financial management systems, timekeeping systems, the other requirements, grantees, and stuff like that?
There were not comments on any specific brand of system or functionality. The exceptions would be a strong interest in an ability to share data effectively using technology back and forth between grantor and grantee. But we did not capture information about they are using a system, for example, from Grant Solutions, or a system from HRSA, or a system from any other agency. We did not capture that as part of the survey. Other questions from the audience? Yes.
Now, a lot of these answers are pretty consistent over the last few years that you've done in the survey. I just wondered if any of y'all thought it would be finding or surprising or concerning.
I think
Stood out.
for me, one of the surprising ones was the really low level of investment in administration of grants. But again, I think there's just like a data issue there a little bit, and targeting that. I guess found that surprising. But honestly, most of the trends that we're seeing and the main topics and the main pain points, I think that we're all feeling those.
Other questions?
So with the pain points at your respective agencies, have you guys had a chance to address the ones that have came out of the survey? I know this is, I don't know how new the survey is, but have that respective agency been to their grantees to say, okay, well, your evaluation, your question, this is what we're going to do to, help with this issue or resolve this situation? Or, come to another, create another, something that can help grantees or just any pain point that you guys expect to get that training.
In the panelists, the folks have had the information about 2 weeks or so now, so it may not mean that they've done something already. Maybe to adjust the question to say, if there were any one thing this survey might prompt you to want to change or do anew or do differently in your agency in the future, what might that one area be that seems the most compelling to you?
Well, and I will just say that one of the things I did find was it is a bit of an affirmation to see the similarities between the pain points to what we are focusing on. I mean, very much what I see as a much greater need for collaboration, technical assistance, communication, and it's affirming the direction that I think our organization is going in the efforts that we would see, especially in the compliance and the administrative side of things.
So for me, it was no surprises, really. I'm curious, I'll be going to GMA this year, so do you guys talk about the survey when you're there? Is there an opportunity there?
I'm not sure if the actual survey will be discussed, but considering the clear need for training, it is a 2.5-day exciting training course of 30 CPEs or the ton, but and it does cover the issues that we've been talking about today from various experts across the country, including yours truly. I would say my biggest takeaway on behalf of grantees and all my clients is the training piece. Admittedly, as a trainer, most people are stuck, and I say that truly, in my training and are pretty miserable in the morning because they have work to do. And usually by the end, the attendees are happy for the training. I don't think you can underscore that enough. And I think that what I would encourage the pass-throughs and the granting agencies is not to hesitate from requiring training prior to awarding of funds. I have actually seen state agencies now say, if you want to be eligible for this funding, even as a formula grantee, you have to attend this training. this is mandatory. Understand, sometimes it's a requirement to be an applicant, so that you're not even applying unless you understand what Uniform Grants Guidance is. And I think that that is a step in the right direction, as well as annual refresher trainings, because all of us need to keep learning. And I think that making those things a requirement from wherever you can, wherever you decide best to get the training from, that is the key piece. It is the true investment. If I'm going to give you millions of dollars, you can spend a couple hundred on training. I just don't think that that's that unreasonable of an ask of your awarding agencies.
And the training piece is very important. A lot of times with the resources that we have, I've encouraged a lot of agencies to put out a do a webinar, walk through the actual documents so they know what's expected of them. So that's something we highly encourage a lot of our recipients to do, participate in the webinar and have multiple webinars and ask the questions and actually give them feedback. So that's been a good tool that I've used in inquiry.
I feel that there wasn't a lot of surprise. I think one thing I would recommend is that maybe you got some good suggestions. Maybe put them out there a little bit more in a wider dissemination, because I think there were some good ideas that came from some of the respondents that should be shared more widely. Number two, I would ask in the future a few more follow-up questions, maybe some step-down types of questions for those who get certain higher ratings on various aspects of their performance or of their internal management systems, to get a sense of what specifically is working, not just what's not working. I always like to see what's successful. I think we don't pay enough attention to success. We pay a lot of attention to problem areas or failures, and then we don't learn a lot from those successes. Okay, so that would be one suggestion I have for you all. I also feel like we need to do a lot more work on getting the relationship between performance and outcomes, and how that all ties into managing programs. A little disappointing is not where I think we need to be, and where I think a lot of grant programs have to be. But we need to do a better job on that, and not just look at evaluation as an afterthought or something that you have to do because it's a requirement. I spend a lot of time training in our world, how we integrate evaluation, data collection, performance, all the way through from before day one, so that you can then be able to make good decisions about your program, enhance the performance, and make the program a success, which is what you want. And also, we didn't talk anything about sustainability, but I have a very significant interest in seeing programs be sustained when they lose their federal or other funding. And that's a question to ask. How are you working towards sustainability, and how does some of these processes help you get there? Really, that's what we want. We want these changes to stay in the communities and survive and thrive. So we need to build some work towards that.
Okay. Please, we've run out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their time. And in April, in 2 months, we will have another Grants Management Breakfast Forum featuring typically a single speaker at George Washington University. You will all get invitations to that. We hope to see you again.